It's my pleasure to present first Arcadio and then Juan Flores, who's going to be discussing his work. Tonight, fresh from the press, we have the Diaspora Strikes Back. Juan Flores is going to have a conversation with Arcadio and then with us. Arcadio is going to make a few remarks and then open the conversation to everyone in the public so that Juan can expand a little bit on the ideas that he exposes in the book. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Arcadio Diaz, who's a prominent scholar, professor at Princeton, and a good friend of Centro for many, many years. Arcadio was the founder, for those of you who do not know this, of CEREP, who was a sister organization of Centro when it was founded way back in the early 70s. So it's a great pleasure for me. We're trying to put a leadership council, and Arcadio is playing a leadership role in that council as well. He's a good friend of Centro, has used extensively our archives for his own research, and it's my pleasure to introduce him tonight. Thank you.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Thank you very much, Edwin, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's really a great joy for me to be here, introducing Juan Flores, who needs no introduction, so that's going to be very easy. And then also to talk a little bit about this beautiful book that I have, that I like so much. I think it's a joy to celebrate the publication of an important book always, and it's particularly, I think, important that we are celebrating this right here at the Centro and in the Centro's library, a place that so many of us cherish and are grateful to. And these topics, of course, are all related to the Centro and its meaning and its foundation and its continuity. So I think it's important to do that here. We are celebrating today also the fact that Juan was just awarded also another prize, this time a prize in Cuba for the second time. The first time was how many years ago, Juan? 30, too many years ago, no? And he has just been awarded a prize for another of his books, a very significant collection of his essays and works. So we are also celebrating that. I want to I found myself really wondering what could I say about Juan Flores today, and I decided that it would be perhaps a good idea to convey briefly, because we want to be brief, so that we can open the discussion, a sense of how I see his work in relation also to this book that deals with diaspora and homeland, with Dominicanos, Puerto Ricanos, and Cubans, but a book that has implications for many other communities and for our contemporary debate and discussion. Juan Flores is a scholar of great distinction, and his work is of great interest to American, Afro, Caribbean, Latin American, and to cultural studies. His pioneering books and essays are widely recognized as a major contribution in shaping Puerto Rican and Latino studies as a field that explores the complex linguistic, literary, and today I want to underline the literary because this book is in many, many ways telling of tales and poetics of narratives too. And the intellectual traditions of Latinos, Chicanos, Dominicanos, Puerto Ricanos, Cubans, and New Yorkers, a term originally used in a pejorative sense by islanders, which later became a term of pride in the diaspora and in the United States. He is also one of the most important voices among Caribbean intellectuals in New York, and he's a cultural activist, deeply engaged in the debates of the city. All along, he has reflected on the object of knowledge of Latino studies and Puerto Rican studies, and particularly on how Latino and Caribbean cultures shape political, artistic, and intellectual traditions in cities like New York, where he grew up, and the East Coast, in Chicago, or in Los Angeles. He has been also a proven institution builder right here at Hunter College, especially as one of the vital members since the very beginning, and later on as a former director of the Puerto Rican Studies Center. He's now teaching at New York University. In his very widely quoted books, Divided Borders, which was published in 1992, and then From Bomba to Hip Hop, Puerto Rican Culture and Latino Identity in the year 2000, Flores has been able to speak critically to scholars interested in American, African American, and Latin American studies because of his flexibility and openness, and because of the extraordinary and unconventional range of his interests. It is worthwhile remembering, and I always like to remember that Flores earned his PhD from Yale University in 1970 in the field of German literature and intellectual history, and got his first academic job at Stanford in the late 60s, where he became involved with the Chicano community. And it was only later that he came back to New York to participate in the foundation of this center. So he's used to coming back home, and coming back home as he does in this more recent book, and to create trouble. He has been a professor in the sociology program at CUNY Graduate Center at Hunter College. So from German literature and intellectual history to sociology and to the center, that's a very interesting trajectory. Flores has turned this rich genealogy into an advantage for the study of diasporic cultures. The theoretical sophistication and the combination of sociological and literary training he brings to his readings, as well as his willingness to deal with the specific, make his work extremely appealing. He is also the translator of the classic memoirs of Bernardo Vega and of Cortijo's Wake, a very significant book by Edgardo Rodriguez Juliá. These titles indicate his long-standing commitment to the study of migration and to the formation of diasporas, to his continuing thinking about slavery and colonial legacies, and to the history of popular music and the importance of New York in that history, but also of displacement, race, and identities. He has always drawn inspiration from the concepts, the theoretical concepts of Gramsci, and more recently from the powerful tradition of intellectuals like Stuart Hall, which is explicitly recognized, acknowledged in this book, The Diaspora Strikes Back. I would like maybe to discuss a little bit of that in the conversation following. Juan is also well known for the new ground he has broken in the study, of course, of popular music, a pioneer, the constant back and forth of musicians from the islands to New York, and his willingness to tackle with the complex issues surrounding the African and Creolized dimensions of Caribbean cultures, and the acceptance of blackness among Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in the diaspora. The book that we're celebrating today, the title is very revealing, The Diaspora Strikes Back, Caribeño, the subtitle is also very important, Caribeño Tales of Learning and Turning. I will briefly summarize what I think is the nucleus of this book. First of all, the diaspora and the homeland are the topics, the main topics. And some of the large and challenging questions are, in my view, first of all, is it really possible to return home? What does going back home mean? He wrote, and it's included here, a very perceptive piece, in dialogue with Stuart Hall, where the word creolite, he claims, cannot be really separated from diaspora. Back home will never be the same precisely because those in the diaspora are going back home and changing the place, and changing even sometimes the sense of place. That explains to a certain degree the title, The Diaspora Strikes Back. And there are very eloquent pages in the book, theoretical and critical discussions of the title itself. What does it mean, The Diaspora Strikes Back? Stuart Hall, whom Juan quotes, has said that creolization, the word creolization, is a sort of forced transculturation in the context of colonization and slavery. That is, not all diasporas are the same, and not all diasporas transculturate to the same degree, says Stuart Hall. Because there are, of course, historic, religious, and linguistics, and many cultural differences and boundaries. Juan accepts that and goes beyond it. And he says in this piece on Creolite, he refers to Martinique, Juan does, as a comparable situation to that of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, but more Puerto Ricans, because Martinique is neither colonial nor post-colonial, seemingly to many anachronistic, because there is no nation state, and can be therefore compared to Puerto Rico. And also can be compared because Martinique and Puerto Rico both have a huge percentage of their population who live in the metropolitan centers. In this case, in the States, in the case of Martinique, in France. That serves Juan Flores the purpose to ask the question, what does diaspora mean? What are its implications? What does transculturation mean? What are its implications? What does it mean to return? What role do diasporas play, comparing, let's say, Martinique and Puerto Rico, in global and local politics when diasporic members return? And what role do diasporas play in the complex topics of identities and identifications? Part of I think, of this book is saying that the Puerto Rican experience has been anticipatory, that historically it is a very important experience, not just for Puerto Ricans, but also because it reveals what is happening now as we speak in many other Caribbean and diasporic experiences elsewhere. The key words in this book are diaspora, return migration, remittances, but not economic remittances as much as what Juan calls cultural remittances, which is a very original way of formulating questions and some answers. The word reverse, to reverse, and that's why I said that one pays very close attention to poets, because there is an acknowledgement here of the poetics of Creolite, some of the, especially the poets from Martinique, La Poétique du Retour, no? What does it mean to return? And retour is not just return, but also how one takes a detour. Retour and detour, no? Are very complex for some of the poets, and one plays with those connotations. What does it mean to return? What does it mean to deviate? what does it mean to transform as we return, to transform the place. But he's also, and I want to say a few words before we open the discussion, he's also doing something quite interesting and quite original here, and different from his other books, because this is a book, that's why I call attention to the subtitle, he's telling stories. And this is a book about Caribeño tales of learning and turning, and all the words there are important. Caribeño tales, learning and turning. He's telling stories. He's a storyteller. And this is crucial in the book, because one draws perceptive and sympathetic portraits which allow us to hear echoes of the actual voices of Puerto Ricanos, Dominicanos, and Cubanos. But anyone who thinks that that storytelling means throwing out analytical discourse is wrong, because the originality of the book is the combination of stories that are being told here as a sort of anthropological side of Juan, and the analysis, not only of the stories, but of the questions raised by those stories, the critical questions raised by those stories. He also, and I think this is very unique in a book like this, most of his sources, some of the most important sources that he uses are poets and literature, whether it is Tato Laviera or other poets. I think that's very significant. Also, the sources that are elevated here to testimony and to raise for the reader as evidence too. Let me quote Juan. He says, "The tales provide a rich fabric of human experience, lived transnational action and interaction as remembered and retold by Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and Cubans, whose lives straddle diasporas and homelands. I call them tales of learning and turning because, partly in response to my prompts and nudges, the tellers have trained their memories on those dramas of insight and understanding." And he's acknowledging his intervention with his informants. Those moments of contact and change that characterize so much of transnational life in our times. And he adds, "I like to think of them as one intricate patchwork with infinite possibilities of extension or reconfiguration." This I find very beautiful. No? It's a patchwork that can be expanded. A narrative collage with as many potential inserts and insets as there are individual and group engagements with translocal cultural movement and transformation. There's a great deal of thought and insight in this paragraph too. The practice of the scholar who is also listening, the art of listening to those voices and to analyze them at the same time. I just quote one more. I have many quotes here, but I would like just to quote how he wrote the book, how he came to write the book, because I think he also tells the tale of his own going back. There is a sort of autobiographical line here in this book, much more than in other books by Juan Flores, where it was sort of taken for granted, but here is very explicit. And he's always, as I said, making trouble. He says, and I quote, "The theme of this book first occurred to me during several visits in recent years to the Puerto Rican city of Mayagüez, where I had been invited, along with a few other Puerto Rican writers from the States, to offer readings and discussions of our work. Surprisingly, large and animated crowds attended the event and cheered us on as we read not only in Spanish, but in English, and in that widely practiced switching code, Spanglish. The audience seemed hungry for the voices and images of Puerto Rican communities in the US, urban settings, and to relish that bicultural mixture of nostalgia for their ancestral island homeland and assertive pride in the fabled mean streets of the Bronx and other inner city neighborhoods in the United States. You see the reverse, no? We're in Mayagüez, and we're nostalgic for those places in the mainland and the inner city neighborhoods. So a real turnaround here has taken place. They went wild when Tato Laviera read his poem, The Eureka, where he speaks directly and defiantly, and in Spanish, to his beloved island, and especially the lines, "Now I return with a Boricua heart, and you scorn me. You look askance, you attack the way I speak, while you're out there eating McDonald's in American discotheques. And I couldn't even dance salsa in San Juan, which I can dance in my neighborhoods full of your customs." Or when Mariposa performed her signature poem, Ode to a Diaspora Rican, with his proverbial chorus, "No nací en Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico nació en mí. I wasn't born in Puerto Rico was born in me." We felt like rock stars. So we have here another tale, another Caribeño tale, where Juan Flores is part of the tale, and he's not only one of the protagonists, he's also the narrator of this tale. And the result is this book. This book that, if I had to summarize, I would say this is a book that tries to show in many different ways, theoretical, critical, and also in narrative way, how you can be part of a nation in a very different way, which is probably the best way. Gracias. I think that we would like to begin a conversation, and maybe I'll start with one or maybe two questions, and then, but I will sit and use the microphone there. I think unless you want to come here and take questions from the audience, whatever you prefer. Maybe right here, because I see it's a large crowd, and maybe you can see from here, no? Can you hear back there? Yes. My first question, Juan, for the discussion would be, could you tell us a little bit more about your informants, about the process of compiling these tales, about shaping the tales, about giving voice to others? I mean, what does that entail? One reads the book, the wonderful testimonies here. It is not the first time it's done, of course, when dealing with a very complex political, cultural situation. And you chose this approach. Could you tell us a bit more? How did you go about it? Did you record and edit? What did you do? If you could tell us a bit more about this. And then we start. I have many other questions, but I'm sure the audience has to.
Great. We should really have a mic at the table so we could just talk. But the way that if you guys were up going this way, it would be easier to do that. But anyway, thank you, Arcadio. Wow, that you've already told them about the book. You don't have to read it now. You can just go home. Now you know. But I think it was a really good summary of what I try to do and what I was involved with in doing this book. So I'll address the question. I think the question goes right to the heart of the project, in the sense that I realized as I began to think, now I should really develop this, because it's interesting to see people going back to their home countries and then, in a sense, form from a diaspora back to the home country, and then forming another diaspora that's formed of people who return from the home country. So it's a double whammy. It's what we call the re-diaspora, or re-aspora, and then playing with re-asporicans. So we found ourselves among the re-asporicans there in Mayagüez, people who are Puerto Rican but from here, that go back and find themselves kind of alienated and in the same kind of expat, diasporic situation when they go to their home country as they did over here. So I found that to be really fascinating, and I then began to look around for anybody else that wrote about this, and I didn't really find anything that was, of much relevance to what I was doing. And I thought, okay, well, I guess this is a new topic. Everybody's talking about transnational flows and all that. But what I did realize early on was that this is a book about experience more than anything, about what people live, how that they live through this, and that's the best possible evidence I could marshal for an argument is to just say, well, people are living it, because not only did I experience it, Arcadio was very right, this is my own experience as a cultural remittance, in a sense, that's what I am. And I go back and I find this kind of a very complicated relation I have to the home culture that is supposed to be embracing me, and I'm supposed to embrace it, and I find other things rather than an embrace often happening, and then but then I hear all these other people telling these stories, and I say, wow, this is really what it's about. It's about experience. So how can I center experience in a book which is about theory, which is about interpreting poetry and music and all this other stuff? How can I center experience? And then I realized, well, these people have told me these stories. I should really gather these stories together, and go out there and sit down with them in a slightly more planned way. And yes, so I got a nice tape recorder, that would be right for the task, and I would make a date with these people and remember the ones that I had heard these stories from, and say, could you tell me that story again? And I guided them. Of course, I had certain things I was looking for. So it wasn't just life stories. Tell me when you were born and what you did when you were a kid. Although sometimes that was also very relevant. But I was really trying to focus on a certain experience, which is that relation between the home country, whether they have ever been there or not, that wasn't even an issue. That what's considered the home country of my parents and my ancestors and so forth, and this experience outside of the country where I'm part of another community. Many of them are people from my own country. That really became the experience I was looking for, and so I identified the people I wanted to talk to by that. If they told a rich story about that, and if that story was central to their lives. If it was just a peripheral thing, I was perhaps listening. But there were many people who would say, that was the key thing when I moved to the States, or when I moved back from the States, or when I moved back and forth, or when my mother moved to the States, or when my kids came to visit. All of those stories that you hear again and again. And I'm sure in this room, there are dozens more of these stories. We could do another book just on the basis of the stories that people in the room would tell. So that's what I did. I identified people, and I began to then have a sample. I tried to figure out, okay, well, I want to get some people who are really young, and some people who are older, some people who went and spent a long time, some people who never went, but they receive members of their family and respond to those people because they have that diaspora cultural experience, and they're bringing it back, and there's a response to that. So I tried to cover the range of people in terms of age, in terms of migratory experience, in terms of class, in terms of generation, and just really gender, sexuality, all the different things that might go into that experience and might play on that experience. So that was really the motivation. And so then I did 22 interviews. I can also tell about why at a certain point I realized that while the Puerto Rican case will be central because that's the one I know best, and I think that's the one of longest duration here in the United States, I wanted to have other people's experience as well. So as to show that it's a general process, not just the case of one example, the one that I happen to know the best. And that's when I began to think, well, maybe the Puerto Rican and the Mexican, because you have a huge diaspora. You have Chicanos going back and Mexican nationals that go back, and there's books about that already, about people going back and what they're doing and cash remittances and all that stuff. So I thought that might be a good Puerto Rico and Mexico. But then I thought, well, Mexico is really huge. It's really big, and a lot of people are writing about that and studying it. It's something that I'm familiar with, but not that close to. So I started thinking, well, the Dominican in New York, if you look at that, that's much more recent, much more concentrated, but very similar processes happen with Dominican New Yorks go back or send back remittances from here, and that it has an effect on the home culture, and on themselves, of course. So I thought that in Puerto Rican, Dominican, and then why don't I just spread it, stretch it out and make it Spanish Caribbean, Caribeño? Because the Cubano will be really different because, of course, it's a very, very different experience and history and politics, and nobody goes back. Very few people go back, so I can't really talk about return migration. But remittances you really can talk about, and the effect that the Cuban American community has had here, especially the new generation of young people, or the people who came before the revolution even happened. The kind of values that they send back are having an explosive effect in Cuba. They're really challenging a lot of what's going on down here. So that was the reason for expanding the sample. But then what I did with these interviews, I have 22 taped interviews, and I want to write a book. What do I do with them? I think, well, I could do what a lot of people do and just make the book a series of interviews. And so you have Juan Flores talking to so-and-so, and you just say question and then the answer. But then I realized I read, those kinds of things, and they kind of bore me, and they get me into a fight with the interviewer. And I say, well, what the hell did you ask that for? Why don't you ask this? You know, so you have this, the main relation becomes the reader and the interviewer, not the person that's being interviewed. So the story, or a lot of people then take an interview and they take a quotes from it and they put it in their own writing. They say, as Joe Blow says here, blah, 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 and they quote them. But then you lose the story, the life story, the experience gets lost in the shuffle. So that's when I began to think, okay, maybe I should try to retain the narrative of the life, not break it up by quoting it, and not put myself in it. You know, I don't need to be there. Have a first-person story. So I reworked those interviews and made them into relatos, short stories, basically, that you could read as though you were reading a short story in a book of fiction. But I didn't change anything they said. All the words are words that they used. I did change sometimes the order, the sequencing, and I had them build up literary style, build up to a climax, or frame them with some interesting comment that the person might have made at one point, even off the book, sort of off the record, made a comment, but I found the comment more interesting than sometimes the story, and made that. So I gave it literary structure in order for the reader to really like them. And then I had to figure out, okay, and I changed everybody's name, so I made it anonymous. You know, you can't immediately know who it is, and some people wanted that protection. And then I also had to figure out, okay, what order am I going to put them in? Should I put the Puerto Ricans first, the Dominicans, the Cubans, or what? How should I do it? And then I began to figure that maybe if I do it chronologically, I'll be able to get a sense of the sweep of history and the change over time. And that's what I wound up doing. Put the older people, the senior people go first, and then move on up until you finally get to the young people. At the last stories are of people in their teens, and the first stories are people in their 80s. And you have and so then came, okay, what do I do with that? I have it set up, I have to interpret the story. So I wrote a part about interpreting, and I found that there was a periodization that you could mark off, that people that we hear mostly in the 40s and 50s had one kind of experience. People in the 60s and 70s was another period where you have that big outburst of political and cultural affirmation, this later 60s and 70s, and then the people from the 80s and 90s and up through the present is another generation. So that's kind of what I did with the stories. And then I realized that I want to put these not at the end of the book or whatever, but to put them right in the middle of the book. And if you see it, you'll see the book. It has them marked off in gray at the side, so that people who don't want to go through the theory part can go straight to the stories and read them because they're fun. You know, and so people might not want to plow through all the stuff, which can be a little bit pondersome, you know, and we'll go straight into life stories that people have, and then maybe try their luck at some of the other stuff. So that was the strategy, you know, for doing it that way, and that's how I would kind of respond to that question. But do we want to go and open it up? I mean, I'm looking at these wonderful faces, and thanks all of you for coming. I mean, good friends. Nice to be here at the Centro again, to be a little homecoming. Thanks to Edwin and others here that work at the Centro. And the book is there. It's at 20% off, and I'll sign it, you know, when we finish our conversation. So please take one along with you when you go. And feedback is always welcome, whether it's now or after you've read it a bit. You can reach me and tell me what you think. You know, I'd really like that kind of feedback. But do you want to pose another question, Arcadio, or would you like to see if there's anybody has any responses to what we've said so far? Anybody like to intervene, comment, tell your story? That's also a possibility. Edwin, you want to?
I have a question for you.
Maybe you should stand up.
Maybe I should. What did you learn about Puerto Rican identities in the plural? You know, looking at formative stages of these people back and forth. What did that tell you about the essence of Puerto Rican-ness, Puerto Rican-nesses in plural?
Well, clearly the multiplicity. That's why you pluralize it, right? The multiple ways of being Puerto Rican. I think that the experience of being in another social environment with different forces at work and different values prevailing and different kinds of struggle create a different sense of nationality. That you might have a very, very patriotic Puerto Riqueño here that loves, you know, his or her country and will wave the flag and everything. But my feeling is that it means something different in a diaspora context and from a diasporic perspective than the same kind of exhibit of identity might have in the home country. So that there is a variation that really needs to be taken into account. And so I do this sometimes by, some of you are familiar with a little story called La Guagua Aérea by Luis Rafael Sanchez. It's kind of really well-known piece. I think it's probably the best-known little piece of Puerto Rican literature right now in the world. I guess probably if people haven't read anything else, they might have read that. And as you know, it's a story of a commuter, the idea of migration as commuting back and forth between places. And you know, you've all read it. It's a really engaging little story, one that's beautifully written and everything, and I've taught it a million times. But what I realized in sort of in harmony with the way my thinking is going is that it's a commute, but it's only one way. Because the only baggage that we see is being brought on the airplane, even though the people don't know which way they're going, they say, is the baggage from the island to the diaspora. So part of my pitch is to say, if you're going to talk about a guagua aérea, make it round trip. Make it really both ways. And let's see what baggage is being brought back in the other direction. So that's part of the motivation for the, you know, for the theme of the book, you know, that there's this change process, this challenge, and that identities, of course, are not only multiple, but not fixed. They're constantly subject to change. And I think that a part of the impact that the return process has, whether it's actual physical return or by remittance, by remitting it to the island, is that it challenges the prevailing culture, particularly the dominant culture, you know, the one from above, in a sense. It represents a challenge sort of from below, that it's first is rejected as foreign, as alien, but it eventually seeps in, and it has its effect, especially among the young generation. They're much more open to realizing that there's another side to this, and it's not just foreign, and they begin to emulate it and appreciate it. And I think that process, I'm interested in identity as process, not as fixed label, but as something which is constantly subject to change, and is constantly changing, and is bringing about change. Not only is it changing, but it's also changing things. So the idea of learning and turning, the turning part is clearly first of the return, so it's returning. But turning also means that it's turning things, it's at an angle from what they've been. You know, they're not at the same angle anymore. They're turned a little bit this way. You know, and that's the idea of turning. So that would be a short version of talking about that. Other points, questions? Arcadio, any more questions for me or for anybody that's here today? Everybody's welcome to speak out. We really welcome that. Raquel?
I'm thinking about all the ways that diaspora works. So there's the Puerto Rican diaspora in terms of Puerto Rico as the origin, and then those of us outside. Then you talked about re-aspora, so Puerto Ricans from here going back. And then I'm also thinking about what Arcadio mentioned, Stuart Hall, and you engaging with his ideas. And that idea that you mentioned of Stuart Hall's of being twice diasporized, he wasn't really thinking about the re-aspora, but it was more like the diasporas that came to the Caribbean that then left from the Caribbean to the metropolitan areas. And then you're talking about the re-aspora, so there's like all these circles and overlaps and yeah, just the concept of diaspora. I'm just trying to figure out what to make of all these overlapping
diasporas is the name of a really important article that I recite again and again, and everybody cites overlapping diasporas, that you could be part of more than one diaspora at the same time. And so you have these original, what I call civilizational diasporas, the African and the Jewish diaspora were the main models, and the Armenian to some extent were the main models for the concept of diaspora going way, way back. You know, it's an ancient term, you know, which has now been given new life because of the massive migratory movements all over the place, and the formation of diasporas all over the place. And so while initially it had a specific reference, it now begins to have a reference to a lot of different things. I say at the very beginning of the chapter on diasporas is that now it can mean anything. You can have a food diaspora, you can have an afternoon reading group diaspora, and you can have, like, it becomes everything. Any kind of grouping that has moved from one place to another becomes a diaspora. So it almost begins to lose its meaning, you know, and things are all bunched together as though they were the same thing. And what I try to do is to pull them apart and say that the diaspora that's formed by people who come, migrate with a lot of capital, whether it's money capital or cultural or education, is a different experience than people who come, poor people who come in a working class diaspora. And that we can't, you know, we use the same word, but let's be clear that we've got to differentiate among all those different things called diaspora. And then there are those movements. So when he says twice removed, he means the African diaspora moving from say, Jamaica to England. So it's now another kind of diaspora. And what I told Stuart is, I said, yeah, but there's another one, which is what happens when the people who go to England and grow up in England as black Brits, which is what he is, go back to Jamaica. You know, they're not going to just fit right in neatly into Jamaica, nor to Africa for that matter, even less so probably. But something happens where they kind of congeal again with a new kind of identity, a return with a familiarity with the culture. In other words, it's not just like traveling somewhere else. You're going back to the country that gives you your identity, your ancestral identity. You're going back there, but you're going back as a different person who has been changed. And meanwhile, the place has changed too. So part of the changing is not just oneself. It's that you go back to a place. I talked to Boricuas that lived here for 45 years. They're 70 years old now. They lived in New York City for 45 years. They hardly speak English after 45 years. And they're back there in some little place. And I found these people up in these remote little towns and that tell me their stories. And over a beer, and I would think to myself after going home, wow, that was some story this guy has. You know, and they go back and you know, so they say, oh, you know, I've changed so much, you know, and I say, yeah, but what about this place? Is this the same place when you grew up? And they say, oh, it's exactly the same. In fact, this tree I'm standing under, this is the same tree I used to stand under when I was a kid, you know. And so nothing. But then when he unravels his story and talks more about himself and the setting, it seems like everything's really changed. So he started off by saying everything's the same, and then he comes out and recognizes by just narrating, just the education of telling the story. People learn. A lot of people, after they finish the interview, say, this is the first time I ever told that story, the first time I ever talked about this. And that's a really inspiring feeling you get, you know, when people and then there's people whose stories have never been validated. That, you know, nobody's been interested in their story, ever. So they've never told it because nobody ever asked them. But I was asking them, so they felt good about that. You know, they felt like my story is worth something. You know, so that was how, and in the process of telling, during the process of telling, they learned something that they hadn't thought of before. And that's what's educational about it. Because if they themselves learn, somebody else has got to learn from that. So that was the way I did that. So that's the idea of these overlapping and multiple diasporas. And I tried to set up a new kind of system of understanding diasporas according to the relations of power. You know, that's my main contribution in that discussion, is that, yeah, there are all these different kinds of diasporas. And there are books about this, you know, about the taxonomies of different kinds of diaspora. But they don't really range them around relations of power. They say there's religious diasporas, there's cultural diasporas, there's trade diasporas, there's labor diasporas, there's imperial diasporas. So they have all these different kind of names for them, but they don't differentiate them around the axis that I think is most important. What kind of power is at work here in determining the lives and the experience of that collective diaspora reality? What's behind it all? So that's what I try to get in that discussion in varying of diasporas. Yeah. Oh, yeah, especially the Afro Betances, right? El Doctor. You notice it? Like, this is from, right? This is Arcadio was the one who taught me about. Is that the same one? I don't know. Oh no, this is Rafael Colón Morales, right? Is that who the painter is? People know. No, it's El Doctor. No, but what Arcadio taught me was that Martorell in the middle 70s, mid 70s, did a portrait of Betances. That was Afro Betances. I had seen this before, but I never really thought of it in that way. But in Puerto Rico in that period, the Afro was arriving in Puerto Rico and had a big influence. And people started, like, I don't know if you saw Lucecita Benitez. She went through this incredible transformation. There's one book that has a picture of her before and after, and she, you know, became Afro. Anyway, that's kind of it's actually not, because it's not irrelevant, because Yedi Rivero wrote this book on tuning in blackness. What's the title of the book? Tuning Out Blackness, where she talks about Lucecita. She doesn't talk about the Betances image, but she talks about how the Afro arrived in Puerto Rico via television. And people started picking up on that and changing their racial identity, their sense of racial identity, as a result of that remittance. You know, interesting.
Let me take this opportunity for another question, if I may. I know there are hands up there. Just one question that has to do with, while reading your book, I thought this is absolutely great. How far do we go back in history? Because you're dealing with migration and return migration as relatively recent processes. But when I thought of Puerto Rico, and here was looking before you arrived at this wonderful photo of Albizu Campos in military uniform while a student in Harvard. Then you go back to let's say the the beginning of the century and to the 1930s, and you think, well, so many things in the island changed politically and socially because of the experience of Puerto Ricans in the States and in New York, or the army, no, or political experiences. Just to mention names: Albizu, of course, Muñoz Marín, of course, Gilberto Concepción de Gracia and Vito Marcantonio and the Independentista Party, César Andreu Iglesias. So, would you call those cultural remittances too, or are they different? Because they change many things in the island. Not to talk about music. No? You yourself have enlightened us a lot about this going back and forth. Let's take La Vilita as an example, no? So historically, how far back can one go? Because so this is very illuminating, not only about the present, but about the past, even though the term diaspora was not used, or globalization much less. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I think when you have these very contemporary debates and discussion and concepts that come up now, you think they're just of now, but then you begin to look back in history and you begin to realize, well, this is really not new. Maybe it's a new form of something that's very old, and I think that's how people now talk about globalization. You realize that there was globalization in the 16th century somehow, you know, and 19th century again, and so you can begin to trace precedents to it and predecessors or antecedents to the same process you're talking about. And I think the same is true here, and that's why I think centering the Puerto Rican case is very appropriate, because it's the longest standing one, certainly of the three Caribbean. The Cubano goes way back too, way back into the 19th century, and you can have somebody even like Felix Padre Varela, who comes here and conceptualizes the Cuban nation from here, from Manhattan. You know, and so you can start to begin to realize, and then also there's a literature about return of the Europeans, because it's assumed that the Italians and the Jews and all, they came and they never went back. That's not true. There's coming back home there's a really good book about all the Italians that went back, and they talk about and they were called the Americani in Italy. They called them the Americani, and they came back with all kinds of ideas of modernity that didn't exist in their hometowns in Italy, and how that changed. So there is a long historical, and in the Puerto Rican case, of course, I do talk about Bernardo Vega and how he has a rethinking of the entire history of Puerto Rico on the basis of his working class understanding and his diasporic connections to other nationalities here in New York City. And I think that's really a very important case. And so I think it goes back. However, just as with globalization and transnationalism, kind of new concepts which seem to refer to very recent and contemporary things, there are differences. And I think the differences now, and the reason why I highlight this and think it's worthy of an interpretation, is that now you're talking about entire communities, not individuals, but people who actually forge communities, and communities which have a history here. So that, yes, they're Puerto Rican, but they're Puerto Rican from here. Their lives are spent dedicated to struggling in those communities to forge those and give a strength to those communities here. So that's a little different. I mean, when Albizu Campos was here, yeah, there were Puerto Ricans here, but I mean, the community was nowhere near the size it became in the subsequent decades and down to the present. And I think that does mean that's a different kind of a diaspora, for one thing, because that was an exile diaspora, you know, different from a working class diaspora, which was the overwhelming majority of Puerto Ricans came in that massive migratory movement of working people and poor people. So there's differentiations to be made, and I think the contemporary version of that, or the more recent history, is that of large-scale migrations where nearly half the population goes away. You know, like over a third of the population of Trinidad lives in New York City. I mean, you know, you're talking about, and Martinicans in Paris. I mean, you're talking about not just a small trickle of people or a small enclave of people, you know, inhabiting a few blocks of one city. You're talking about people that inhabit huge swaths of cities, you know, and come in hundreds of thousands of people. There are 5 Latino groups in New York City that have more than 100,000 people, and that's sizable. So I think that means the quantitative difference means that there's also a qualitative difference in in what the diaspora is, and in the kind of relationship that it will have. Not to mention the changing transportation and communication systems, which make that access much more ready, right? It's right there. I mean, nothing can really happen here without it already being in Puerto Rico the next day. I mean, it gets transmitted very, very quickly. So those are changes which I think eventually take on a qualitative kind and make the kind of thing I'm talking about much more salient and of our times. The two experiences that have been written about in this kind of a way, or at least signaling similar things, are very far removed from what most of us know about. One is that the German Turks, the Turkish so-called guest workers that went to Germany for several generations and now have been returning to Turkey. They're German-speaking Turks. And they go home and they're not just young Turks, they are weird Turks for the Turkish. And they're challenging a lot of those old, long-standing, hard-set kinds of ideologies that prevail in Turkey, on the basis of that experience in Germany. And I'm not saying, and the other one, before I get to the next point, is that the other case in point is the Japanese Brazilians, who from Sao Paulo, who have been recruited back because there was a labor shortage in Japan. And they said, okay, let's bring in our own ethnic kind. Let's bring our own people in instead of just some Koreans or something like that, or Chinese or something. Let's bring in some Japanese. So they bring in these Brazilian people who are of Japanese background, and this is a couple of really good books about them. They talks about these Japanese Brazilians on a train in somewhere in Japan, and they get on the train, and the Japanese people are sitting there like, well, what are these people? They look like us, but look, they bring these tropical shirts, and their body language is completely different. They speak a different language. What are they, So it reminded me a little bit of the New Yorker, going back to Puerto Rico, So those are the two, though I found actually good books about that, and those were good guides for me, in this work. I had something else, but I forgot what it was. I can take another question. Oh, yeah. Yes, back there.
Yeah. You say you found all these differences. Do you try to tie them back together into, like a meaning of the whole collective?
A meaning of the whole collective.
Well, the diaspora. I see that you unpack it. So, do you repack it?
Well, I try not to bring closure, if that's what you mean, or see it as something that is a remedy for something, or
I don't mean that.
It's not a solution. I mean, I'm trying to be more descriptive, but I think it has consequences. But I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking for or about.
Well, what I'm asking is that you start with a diaspora and you break it up into all these different
kinds,
different kinds of diaspora. But there still is a concept of diaspora. And so you did do a taxonomic thing. But I'm trying to find out, okay, so we have all these differences and we know different things. Do you put them together back? You said you had community. Is there a transnational community? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm not trying to, by saying that there are many different kinds, I'm not saying that the term is meaningless. I think that the term's still useful, and it means certain things. It's the scattering, or the sowing of the seeds, as the word from the Greek. It's a scattering of people from their homeland to different places around the world, and the forming of communities. And generally, the scattering happens as a result of violence or force. It's not just people splitting, because I like it up there, but there's usually some kind of impulse for them to leave, like being asked to leave or being forced to leave, as in the African diaspora, right? So there's a violence there. And there's also, to make it a diaspora, there's also an ongoing relationship to the homeland. If people just split and forget about it and they just become something else, that's not really a diaspora. It's when there is this kind of very charged, tense relationship to the home country, whether it's their own experience or their parents or their ancestors. Those two factors sort of have to be there for it to be a diaspora, and so the term has meaning. But what I'm trying to say is that same experience will vary according to a lot of things, and there'll be a lot of other conditioning factors involved. And as the main one I bring out is the class dimension, frankly, the question of economic and political power, and how those people that are moving relate to that. If people arrive with a lot of education and cultural capital and wealth, they're going to have one kind of experience, and they're going to have one kind of relation to their home country. And they may go back and be really, really rich, and that happens. We see that for example, the Indian, this South Asian diaspora is kind of like that. I mean, when you read the stories, it's like, this is the exact opposite of what I'm talking about. And yet they're both diasporas. So that's kind of thing. But I don't try to, I'm not sure if I'm getting it, but
I mean, how do they relate to each other? You have all these differences, especially when you break them down in terms of power. I mean, as a collective thing, what is it?
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I really don't know how to answer that.
Right.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Tony?
Yeah. In 1966, when I was at Thea's house, I was a Yankee. In 1972 to 74, I was a New Yorker. now Nuyorican is an identity reference that has some value. And from your perspective, your analysis, when did the shift occur from pejorative to an identity reference of value? In 40 years.
In 40 years? Well,
maybe a milestone of a time period where there's some milestones where the shift started to happen.
Right. I think that it could be pretty well marked off as kind of the mid-70s is when they, well, I mean, the story is, and I tell it in the book, is when Algarin and Piñero went down there, you know, and they were dismissed as Nuyorican and dissed as Nuyorican. And you know, they turned it around. It's that kind of like re-signifying thing. The same with black and the Black Power movement. You know, black was a derogatory, became an affirmation. Oh, so you call me Nuyorican? Okay, I am a Nuyorican, and I'm proud to be a Nuyorican. That kind of reflex action, I think, is around that time. Other people here might have other opinions about that. It's still up for grabs. I don't think there's one, you know, final narrative about it. But that's kind of how I look at it. I think it's once people really get their feet on the ground and they feel confident about being from here, and they don't have to be ashamed of it, and yet at the same time, there's no way they're going to give up their Puerto Ricanness. And so they got this dual, you know, double consciousness, as Du Bois called it, you know, this kind of thing. And instead of it being an impairment, you know, something that it holds them back or they have to feel ashamed of, you begin to say, okay, I can be this dual, I can have this dual allegiance and this dual sense of affirmation. And that's what happened, I think, and it's heroic. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, and I think it then set the stage for what the Dominicana was going through today very, very clearly. Dominican York was like, you know, you go down there, and Dominican York is like the lowest thing in the world. And yet you have people here saying, yeah, I'm proud to be, and some of the stories in the book, I mean, you got to read those stories. They're fabulous about the Dominican, they're heroic people, you know, and then, you know, in another way, the Cubano is the same. I mean, some of these Cubanos now that are really defying and challenging the government and Fidel and all that from the left, not fanatically from the right, but from the left, you're betraying the ideals that was supposedly this was all about. You know, those ideas are having an impact in Cuba that nobody can really deny. I mean, and it's really striking how that happened. So I try to give explanatory value to it. You know, it's not just magic. It's not a mystery. They're happening because they're part of a pattern that's taking place in the world. Andy.
Okay. Extending to the political, let's say, to the political dimension, okay? I can see, and a lot has been said about how this, let's say, Diaspora complicates the traditional anti-colonial project. What do you think, on balance now, is the effect of this dynamic on the statehood project in Puerto Rico? On balance.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is very political. I mean, you talk about culture now, but it is very political, and so I think that there's two things I remembered what I wanted to say before, and that is that I was walking a fine line, you know, because it might sound like I'm saying, oh, people come to the United States and they get this wonderful American culture, you know, with all this democracy, and then they bring that back, and I'm not saying that. I'm saying almost the opposite of that. That people come here and have to fight their butts off to be human, to be considered human. They have to fight for their rights. They have to fight against racism, and they have to fight against all the inequality that working class diasporans face, particularly of color. And this is what we're talking about here. You know, and so that's what's being learned. It's almost like an oppositional culture is being learned, not an embracing of everything American and bringing that back. So that was one of the toughest parts of lodging this argument, and I had to make that really, really clear there. So, and that's of course a political thing too. So when these people in Mayagüez, that Arcadio was so nice as to tell a little story about the times we went down there, year after year, like 4 or 5 years we did this. We went down there. It was with Tato, Sandy, with really good people, down there reading. When these people down there, the Diasporicans, liked us and wanted us, wanted to be with us and hang out, and we hung out a lot with them. They weren't for statehood. They weren't saying, oh, we want to be Americans. On the contrary, but they wanted to affirm that life that they led here in the South Bronx, and in El Barrio. They want to feel like I'm not going to lop that off and make believe it never happened the way that people before them did. Some of the old timers had to do that. They said, when I got back, I had to make believe I never went away, but there was a change there, and that happened. So they're not like, I didn't meet any of them saying, oh, that we just got to become American, and we got to become part of the United States. So I don't think that while it can seem that way, it can't. It wasn't a reinforcing of the ranks of the PNP or anything on the part of these people. I was afraid of that, and I think some of the bureaucrats that invited us, they meant that. They were trying to get us to go in that direction, but we were explicitly refusing that at every turn, saying, well, this is not what we're here for, and that's not what we're about, and we don't agree with that, and we got to fight against United States imperialism and blah, blah, blah. We did the whole number with them to make clear where our politics were going. But I think that you know, getting onto what just your question, I think that this has deep political ramifications. I mean, you know, like bringing these kinds of concepts and values, especially around issues of gender and race, into play, and really undermining the kinds of accepted conservative ideologies that prevail. And another general point I want to bring out is that I'm not saying that nothing's happening in those countries for change. I think they are. And I think what happens is that some of this progressive diasporic values and ideas reinforce those changes that are already taking place. For example, around the issues of race in Puerto Rico. You know, there's, you know, for 30, 40 years now, there's been more and more attention to Afro-Boricua experience and to racism within the Puerto Rican community and all that kind of stuff. It's not like it wasn't happening. But I think when you get people going down there who grew up with African Americans and grew up affirming their blackness here and saying, yeah, I'm black and I'm proud of being black and I'm proud of being part of the civil rights movement, going back there, that's going to bring that's going to catalyze a lot more change and maybe make it faster or more or deeper somehow. That's what I'm saying, you know, and I want an opportunity to say that. So I think that the political implications of this are very, very profound and have unfortunately not been noticed adequately, is what I'm saying. That we're not really taking account of that as a variable because our habits of thinking are that everything positive goes one direction and not the other. You know, and that's always been my politics too. The radical implications are coming from the colonies to the metropole. And so the colonial peoples are challenging inside the belly of the monster. I mean, that's the kind of thing we've lived with, and I still believe that. But at the same time, there's another flow going on, and because a lot of those elites in the home countries are propping up that imperial relationship. And the working people who go back with these values of struggle and values of challenge are beginning to eat away and helping to eat away at those dominant conservative ideologies in the home countries. And that's certainly with the Dominicano. I mean, it's so blatant and obvious that kind of thing is happening.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I don't know if you know about this, but this week, Jose Feliciano was in Puerto Rico, and he made a fuss because he said in TV, please protect your banner and never go for statehood. And I was there. And that was in the program, in one of the most seen programs in the TV. Everybody was like, you know, this guy is saying this, you know, I mean, and so that maybe answers your question. And the other thing is, a question. That was Jose Feliciano, the singer. Yeah. And so, you know, that was big there. And for you as a student of the diaspora, what is the biggest similarity between Puerto Ricans in the island and Puerto Ricans in New York, and the biggest differentiation? And by the way, you know why the Guaguari is just back here? Because when you go back there, you go by La Rosa del Monte. You know, with a lot of things. People that go there, they go with TVs and with, you know, so they can. Mucho bagaje. Mucho bagaje, yeah. So that's right. So that's what the Guaguari is just one way. But please address my question.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to like specify the most when you're talking about a collectivity. You know, like what is the most, the salient thing that remains Puerto Rico no matter where you are. Hasta la luna, as they say. You know, I just find it I get nonplussed when I get a question like that because I come out with an answer and I immediately start thinking of the exceptions and the people. Yeah, well, that may be true of them, but it's not true of them. You know, and that's what makes life so interesting. You know, that it's very difficult to just pinpoint and say that is the feature. And that's what people try to do when they talk about culture. They say the culture means this, you know, and they try to signal out maybe 1, 2, 3 traits, and that's the culture, and that's what it means to be Puerto Rican. And no matter where you are, if you got those 3 traits, then you're Puerto Rican, you know? And then I think of all the people who aren't Puerto Rican who have those traits. Or I think of the Puerto Ricans who have 2 of them, but not the 3rd. So what do you do with all that, you know? And so I'm very, very reluctant, you know, to make cultural generalizations, you know, or to single out something that is particularly, because, you know, Spanish language, nah, we know it's not that. And that's usually what Latinos are talked about. What unites Latinos is they all speak Spanish. BS, they all speak Spanish. You know, you can go to whole stretches of New York City or LA, and you run into like thousands of Latinos, and only a few of them speak Spanish. You know, so what do you do about that? Or they speak indigenous languages, right? So the language, the religion, they're all Catholic. Yeah, right. You know, so I mean, anything you bring out as a unifying trait, you begin to you eat away at it. And I just think that doesn't mean culture doesn't mean anything. It's just that you can't reduce it. You know, you can't just boil it down and just see what the sediment is. It's just not that easy. You've got to take it in all the warts and all the different contours and all the contradictions. That's the kind of object of knowledge that we're working with. So it's a constantly moving, shifting target. Very dynamic, and somehow you have to try to reproduce that dynamic and still have, you know, in what you write about, in your interpretation, reproduce the dynamic, but not try to simplify. Not boil it down. It doesn't boil down. Culture does not boil down. You can quote me on that one. Anyway, so I didn't answer. Maybe over a beer. Maybe over a beer. Well, it'll come up. You know, so it'll come up with it. But I can't. I find it too difficult.
No, you didn't really answer that. That's what I think.
I answered. Oh, good. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay.
A question about cultural institutions on the island. In the visual coda and the end of your book, you talk a little bit about how the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture had their, I can't remember all of it, I read it really fast on the way today, but could you talk a little bit about maybe how how people here going back have influenced the kind of official culture, if you will, or the kind of big institutions, and maybe in your conversations, did people feel a connection to the Centro Culturales in their local village or town, or do you have any connection at all on that?
So you're mainly interested in the institutional dimension of this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the book, I explain. I give this example, which is a really rich one, of Jorge Soto. Some of you remember Jorge Soto. He passed away many years ago, but he was a very important figure in the cultural life of New Yorkers, basically. I think in the world of visual arts, he was the most prominent person and the loudest voice, and definitely the loudest voice, and also some of the most articulate person to express that. But it passed away sort of early on in this whole process, back in I guess it was the, late 70s that he passed away. He just was not around anymore. But he, among many, many other things, he was really irreverent. And one of the things he did was he saw the seal, the official seal of the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña, which has the three figures, you know, the Taíno, the Español, and the Africano. And they were placed in a certain way. This was by Lorenzo Omar, by the way, when he returned. And it places the Spaniard, you know, you've seen it. If you've seen any of the books here, you know, you have the Spaniard in the front with a book, you know, and then you have the Indian with the loincloths and the sheaf of corn, and you have the African with, I don't know what, ball and chain, I don't know what they have, but anyway, it's there. And so Jorge took it and really messed with it. You know, he took all their clothes off just at the beginning, and he made the Spaniard into a kind of a skeleton, or carrying a skull, and he made the Taíno became a fertility goddess, you know, and the African was very strong, you know. So he changed everything around. He re-signified the seal of the Instituto de Cultura, which was a very irreverent thing to do at the time. I mean, you know, here. So I reproduced that in the book. You know, here's the official seal on top, and then this is Jorge's version of the seal. So that was a good example to me of the challenge that the Nuyorican can represent. You know, in the face of these. I mean, this is really that seal and what it stands when you think about it. The way that it places the Spaniard with the book, you know, the learning, the mind, the intelligence of the Puerto Rican is because of the Spanish blood, you know, and that was the ideology. Read Pedreira. I mean, that was the ideology, and that remains to this day in many ways for many people still the prevailing ideology. When they say syncretism and tenemos tres raíces, okay, yeah, but what is the value of these? You know, it's not like they're all equal. And it's not like the confrontation among them was on the basis of equality. You know, we're all just going to hang out and hold hands. There was power involved in that, and there was subordination. You know, and this kind of reproduced that. Lorenzo Omar, who was working at that time with the Instituto de Cultura, and I think that frankly the motivation behind it was Ricardo Alegría. I mean, he's the one who wanted that. So I attribute it not so much even to Omar as to Ricardo Alegría, who's now worshipped as the father and dean of Puerto Rican culture. But what was the ideas behind this stuff? And he's the one who kind of discovered the Tainos and discovered the African with his archaeological work and all that other stuff. But yet, with what mentality, what ideology prevailed when he was doing this, setting this forth? This is the way Puerto Rican culture is still conceived in the school, in the high schools. That's the way it's represented. So a New Yorican coming along and saying, wait a minute, and messing with the whole thing and tearing it all apart and saying, wait a minute now, on the basis of an anti-Eurocentric point of view, of a person fighting racism tooth and nail, that's what the content of diaspora culture becomes in this kind of a situation. When you bring that to the island, not as a foreigner, but as a Boricua to the island, it's going to have an effect. It's going to be dismissed, it's going to be sidelined and all that, but eventually it's going to seep in. And then some years later, they invited a bunch of us down to the Ateneo to talk about New Yorican culture, and we did, and we really talked it up down in the Ateneo Puerto Riqueño, these sacred places. And, it's kind of shocking to people, but I know that they were shocked when they heard the way we were talking, but when they left, I don't think they stopped thinking about it. I think they started saying, okay, this isn't just gringos coming down here telling us how to live. These are Boricuas that have lived a life of struggle, and they have things that we can learn from them. So it's been a real battle, but I think that, as time has gone on, and the chapter on hip hop and open mic about the poetry, and the way that there's been an approachment between the young generation of poets, aspiring young writers, and the writers from here, for the first time, and Arcadio is witness to this as well, that we witnessed the writers from the island and the writers from here, like, as completely separate from each other and hostile toward each other, because you have different kind of literary cultures on the island and in a working class diaspora like the one in New York. So you've got organic writers coming right from the poverty, without even a formal education, writing poetry, like Pietri, people like that, Pedro Pietri. And then on the island, you still have this kind of elite infrastructure that controls the kind of things that are really considered poetry. That's not poetry, that's sociology or something, That's the rantings of some fool, But that when I see these young people hanging out together and doing their poetry, one after another, some in English, some in Spanglish, some in Spanish, it's great, because some are from here, some are from there, and yet they feel like they're doing something together. And that is, for me, that was, as a literary historian, that was a moment that I'll never forget. And I think it represents a very important change. Time, yeah. Yeah, we do have time. But I see Marcus. One more question. Marcus.
Thanks. I
my
really wait
mi amigo alemán.
read the book. So it sounds just so fascinating. And I probably have like a whole million of questions. But
We'll allow you to.
Let me maybe just raise one on a subject maybe that hasn't been so touched upon as much in the previous question. And this is about how does the intensity of mobility shape the diasporic experience, the experience of power, the experience of cultural citizenship. By intensity of mobility, I mean the difference between someone who can go forth and back all the time, and someone who can go back and forth maybe only once in a long time, or maybe in a lifetime. And that relates to very recent sociological debates about mobility, where some make that argument, there's a new class divide between the mobile or the highly mobile and the immobile. Do you see in your material how this plays out?
Definitely. I mean, those are variants, and they're not always class differences, because with Puerto Riqueños, and given that the Caribbean is kind of relatively close, and there are frequent flights, and you can find off season, they're not even that expensive. So there's a lot of back and forth, of course, and to some extent, especially for very far distant countries, there's a class difference. You just can't afford to go back, and the same like with the Brazilian immigration into New York. People say, well, there's a lot of Brazilians, but how many Afro-Brazilians are there? Not very many, because most of the time the Afro-Brazilians can't really afford to be coming into New York and settling in forming a diaspora here. So there are differences in that. Some of the people said, oh, I was in New York for 40 years, but I came every year, or twice a year I came back to be with my family. And there were others who left and didn't go back for 30, 40 years. They never went back. And then finally they went back. So of course, that's a very different kind of return. And the place will look very, very different. My own father didn't go back for 70 years. And when he went back, I took him there. And he would say, oh, yeah, hey, that Maya West, let's go into the plaza. That's where all the poets hang out, you know. So I said, Dan, you know, the plaza, first of all, the plaza has changed. The cafe that you used to hang out with these poets hasn't been there in 50 years, you know. And you know, so I took him in, and he would look around and say, oh, this is really different now. He hadn't been back for 70 years. But if he had been going back every year, it wouldn't have been so strange. So that's a good question, and then one could just spin off a whole analysis based on that. But I tried to make sure that there were people who, among the sample, the 22 people, there were some people who go back a lot, and there were some people who hardly ever go back, and there's some people who never did go back. Some people who come, and I interviewed them here, they never went back, but they still have a huge relationship, a very intense relationship with the island. You know, so all different, I tried to get all different possible permutations that I could think of in defining the sample.
No, I just want to thank Juan. I think we all want to thank him for this. And to congratulate him again. And I also want to thank Edwin Melendez and the Centro for organizing this and for having us here and for your hospitality and generosity. Thank you very much.
Thank you all of you.
Thank you.